February 1946. 6 Mafia guns were pointed directly at Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson inside a Manhattan back room. Lucky Luciano had come to take Harlem's numbers racket, and everyone in that room understood this meeting could end in blood. No shots were fired, but what Bumpy Johnson did next changed Harlem's fate for decades. So what did Bumpy Johnson do in that room that made Lucky Luciano back down? After World War II, New York reorganized its criminal map quickly. Harlem did not change. The war's end did not weaken its internal economy or soften its rules. What outsiders mistook for chaos was already a system. According to police files and later internal summaries, Harlem generated steady cash without banks or contracts. Money moved daily locally and predictably. There was no single vault to seize and no single pipeline to cut. That made the system resilient. The engine of that economy was the numbers racket. It functioned openly, routinely, and without interruption. Bets were collected each morning, results posted publicly, and winners paid on time. Reliability mattered more than intimidation. For Harlem's black community, the numbers were not optional income. They paid rent, food, medical bills, bail, and funerals. The system existed because legal institutions had excluded them. Shutting it down meant destabilizing the entire neighborhood. This was the first mistake outsiders made. They assumed pressure would collapse the operation. In Harlem, pressure activated coordination. Push one block and resistance surfaced everywhere else. Italian crime families had taken most of New York the same way. They applied force-removed local operators and installed their own collectors. That formula worked in Brooklyn, the Bronx, and downtown Manhattan. In Harlem, it failed repeatedly. The failure was structural, not tactical. Harlem did not depend on one boss or one chain of command. Its economy was distributed across thousands of personal relationships. There was no head to cut off. This reality was tested decisively in the 1930s by Dutch Schultz. Schultz believed Harlem was simply another market-resisting takeover. He arrived with money gunmen and a reputation built on fear. He expected compliance. By the summer of 1935, Schultz's problem was no longer profit. Harlem continued to generate cash and refused to submit. There was no open war to justify a full takeover. The resistance was quiet, organized, and deliberate. That quiet defiance was the most dangerous kind. It produced no shootouts, no arrests, and no obvious enemy. Harlem did not confront Schultz publicly. It refused to move. Schultz understood that another hidden killing would change nothing. Fear had to be visible, not discovered later. It had to be delivered in public in front of witnesses. Violence only mattered if it changed behavior. That was why the assignment could not go to a local man. Anyone from New York carried obligations and instincts shaped by Harlem's internal rules. Schultz needed someone untouched by those limits. Someone who would not hesitate. Chicago provided that kind of man. Its streets produced killers trained to dominate space rather than negotiate silence. Reputation, speed, and presence were treated as sufficient. Schultz believed Harlem would respond the same way. He was wrong. Schultz was killed months later in a New Jersey tavern, not in Harlem. The location mattered. Harlem did not need to execute him on its streets to defeat him. After Schultz, no Italian crew attempted to take Harlem by force. The lesson was clear. Violence created consequences without control. Any future attempt would require restraint. By the mid-1940s, Harlem carried a reputation absent from official reports. It was known as a place where takeovers failed quietly. Police understood this even when it was not written down. So did organized crime. By 1946, the numbers racket was no longer a vulnerability. It was leverage. Leverage required someone capable of holding it without collapsing the system. Someone who understood limits better than aggression. That authority was not declared. It was recognized. Boundaries were tested cautiously and responses came later. When they arrived, they ended negotiations. That man was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He did not claim Harlem through spectacle or conquest. He maintained it by making takeover more expensive than cooperation. By the time the Mafia came calling in 1946, that reality was already understood. What remained was whether it would be respected. The answer would not come through gunfire. It would come in a room where guns were present and deliberately unused. Harlem had already decided how that confrontation would end. In early 1946, Lucky Luciano was no longer thinking like a man expanding territory. He was thinking like a man preparing to leave. That distinction altered every calculation he made in his final weeks in New York. Departure demanded containment, not ambition. Luciano's release from prison was not an act of forgiveness. According to federal records and later investigative reconstructions, it followed a wartime arrangement designed to eliminate risk rather than deliver justice. The U.S. government needed influence at the docks and stability among labor unions during the war. Luciano provided cooperation when disruption was unacceptable. The cost of that cooperation was absolute. His sentence was commuted, but his continued presence in the United States was not permitted. Deportation to Italy was mandatory and permanent. Freedom in Luciano's case came with an expiration date. By February 1946, the timeline was fixed and public within law enforcement circles. 3 weeks remained before Luciano would be placed on a ship and removed from American soil. No appeals were pending and no extensions were expected. Every unresolved issue now carried the weight of a deadline. Luciano understood what followed unfinished exits. He had seen organizations fracture when leadership disappeared without order. Violence did not preserve power. It attracted attention, arrests, and internal retaliation. None of those consequences could be managed from exile. Most of New York had already been stabilized. The 5 families were aligned, leadership roles clarified, and revenue streams secured. Frank Costello handled daily administration while Albert Anastasia maintained enforcement and control of the docks. Those structures were designed to function without Luciano's physical presence. One territory remained unresolved. Harlem was not hostile, but it was not absorbed. It continued to operate independently outside Italian enforcement. That independence made it unpredictable. Luciano did not need Harlem to increase profits. He needed Harlem not to detonate after his departure. A conflict uptown would not stay contained and would destabilize the city. The consequences would fall on an organization he would no longer be present to steer. This reality removed force from the list of options. Violence could not resolve Harlem within 3 weeks. It would introduce variables that could not be controlled once Luciano was gone. Predictability mattered more than domination. The numbers racket intensified the pressure. Millions moved weekly through a system the Italians did not manage or regulate. Any disruption risked police scrutiny, community backlash, and retaliation. Harlem was not a prize to be seized, but a fault line to be stabilized. Luciano understood the precedent clearly. He knew what had happened to Dutch Schultz when intimidation replaced restraint. Harlem did not respond to aggression with submission. It responded with delayed consequences that ended conversations permanently. That history narrowed Luciano's choices. Aggression was eliminated as a viable strategy. Delay was no longer possible. Containment became the only objective. Luciano needed Harlem neutralized as a variable. He needed assurance that no Italian crew would provoke retaliation after his departure. He needed an arrangement that would hold without his supervision. That outcome required consent rather than fear. Consent could not be extracted in Harlem. It had to be negotiated. Negotiation meant acknowledging the authority already in place. Ignoring that reality would accelerate collapse. The message was therefore sent carefully. No threats accompanied it. No deadlines were imposed. An invitation was delivered once and then allowed to sit. The silence that followed was not misinterpreted. Luciano understood immediately that any meeting would occur on Harlem's terms. Time was already working against him. Pressure would only harden resistance. By the time a response came, Luciano had adjusted his posture. He was not approaching as a conqueror. He was approaching as a man seeking stability. That posture governed every decision that followed. This was not ambition. It was damage control. Luciano was not trying to win Harlem. He was trying to leave New York intact. The calculation was simple and unforgiving. A controlled agreement could preserve order long after his departure. A failed confrontation could unravel years of structure in days. Luciano chose the outcome he would not be present to repair. By the time he entered the room weeks later, the strategy was already fixed. There would be no threats and no displays of force. Only terms, restraint, and an acceptance of limits. The countdown had already decided everything else. The message sent to Harlem was precise and restrained. It did not threaten, flatter, or negotiate. It simply proposed a meeting naming no terms and implying no urgency. In the underworld, that alone carried weight. The invitation traveled through trusted channels rather than loud intermediaries. No deadlines were attached and no follow-up was promised. The absence of pressure was intentional. It signaled confidence rather than impatience. When the message reached Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, it was read once and set aside. No acknowledgement was sent in return. No refusal was issued. The silence began immediately. Day 1 passed without reaction. No counter-message arrived and no inquiry was made. Harlem continued operating as if nothing had changed. The numbers racket ran uninterrupted. By the third day, the silence had acquired meaning. In that world, unanswered messages were not ignored. They were evaluated. Silence functioned as an assessment, not an absence. Those close to Bumpy understood the choice. Responding too quickly would have framed the meeting as a concession. Responding too slowly would have suggested avoidance. 7 days created balance. Each day without response increased the cost of escalation. Forcing contact would have required pressure. Pressure would have altered the terms before discussion even began. Silence preserved leverage. Inside Italian circles, the lack of reply did not go unnoticed. It was discussed quietly rather than challenged publicly. No one suggested forcing the issue. That restraint reflected understanding rather than hesitation. For lucky Luciano, the silence confirmed what he already suspected. Harlem would not be approached on Italian terms. Any meeting would require adjustment. The question was how much. Luciano did not send a second message. Repetition would have weakened the first. Following up would have suggested need. He chose to wait, allowing the silence to speak. Waiting carried risk. Each day reduced his available time in the country. The pressure was asymmetrical, and he knew it. That imbalance made the silence dangerous. On the 7th day, no response still came. Yet no enforcement followed. No warning was issued. Nothing happened, and that was the point. The absence of reaction signaled control. Harlem was not scrambling to negotiate. It was not mobilizing for defense. It was neither afraid nor aggressive. The silence reframed the entire exchange. This was no longer a request answered on demand. It was an evaluation conducted at Harlem's pace. Control had shifted quietly. Luciano understood the implication. If the meeting happened, it would occur under conditions he did not dictate. The silence established that reality without confrontation. That was its function. This was not defiance. Defiance invites correction. Silence invites interpretation. Luciano chose interpretation. The lack of response eliminated shortcuts. No threats could be issued without breaking neutrality. No inducements could be offered without acknowledgement. Silence locked the board in place. Those around Luciano advised patience. They understood that pressure would create instability. Instability would invite scrutiny. That was the last outcome he could afford. By the time word finally came that a meeting would occur, nothing had been negotiated. No terms had been exchanged. No hierarchy had been affirmed. The silence had done its work. The invitation had not been accepted. It had been absorbed. The delay reshaped the meeting before it happened. Control shifted without movement. What did not happen mattered most. No reminder was sent. No emissary was dispatched. No enforcement was hinted at. In the underworld, silence often precedes violence. Here it replaced it. That distinction defined everything that followed. The meeting would not be about submission. By choosing not to answer, Bumpy forced the next move without making one. Luciano would either accept altered conditions or abandon the attempt. That was the choice created by 7 days of quiet. When the meeting was finally scheduled, it carried no illusion of advantage. Both sides understood the recalibration. The silence had established parity before a word was spoken. The invitation had done its job by failing. It revealed limits, pressure, and intent. Silence in this case was not absence, it was the opening statement. The room was selected long before any message was answered. It was neutral territory distant from Harlem and equally removed from Italian strongholds. No side could claim ownership of the space. That neutrality was the first layer of control. According to later accounts, the location was evaluated for more than privacy. Sightlines were measured, exits counted, and movement paths anticipated. The room was not chosen for comfort or prestige. It was chosen because it could be contained. Every object inside the room had been considered. The table created distance without isolating anyone. The walls offered no blind corners and no cover. Nothing in the layout encouraged sudden movement. This was not decoration. It was prevention. Violence thrives in uncertainty and clutter. The room was designed to deny both. Those invited were selected with equal precision. Each man present represented a function rather than companionship. Their presence communicated reach, capacity, and consequence. No one was there by accident. Lucky Luciano did not need to announce authority. The men around him did that silently. Each carried a reputation that required no explanation. Together they formed a perimeter without standing up. Frank Costello's presence signaled continuity. He represented what would remain after Luciano left the country. Albert Anastasia's inclusion signaled enforcement without instruction. Their proximity replaced verbal warning. The absence of unnecessary figures mattered as much as those included. No extra muscle crowded the room. Excess numbers would have suggested insecurity. Restraint projected confidence. Weapons were visible but not dominant. They were placed where they could be seen without being reached for. Their exposure was intentional and controlled. Guns were present to stop war, not start it. In that room, weapons functioned as punctuation. They ended arguments before they could form. No one reached for one because no one misunderstood their role. The guns froze choices rather than expanded them. Every man present understood the rule. The first person to touch a weapon would lose control of the room. Violence would not produce victory here. It would only collapse structure. This understanding kept posture rigid and movement minimal. Hands stayed visible. Chairs remained occupied. Discipline became the governing force. When Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson arrived, the room was already settled. No one stood to greet him. No one pointed to a seat. The omission was deliberate. Bumpy entered without escort. That fact registered immediately. Coming alone reduced variables rather than increasing risk. It communicated calculation, not courage. This was not bravado. Bringing men would have escalated the room's purpose. Arriving alone removed justification for enforcement. It simplified the equation. The room adjusted without moving. Eyes tracked posture, not position. No one spoke because speech would have invited response. Silence preserved the test. Bumpy did not pause to assess the room. He moved as if the layout had already been disclosed to him. That familiarity unsettled more than surprise would have. It suggested preparation rather than improvisation. The timing of his arrival mattered. He was neither early nor late. He arrived when the room was ready. That synchronization reinforced control. No one blocked his path. Doing so would have triggered correction. Allowing passage preserved neutrality. The room continued to hold. This moment was not about dialogue. It was about calibration. Who moved first, who waited, and who observed mattered. Power was being measured before words were allowed. Luciano watched carefully. He understood the importance of allowing the room to work. Intervening too early would have undermined the structure he had built. Observation was restraint. The men around the table followed that example. No one adjusted their chair or shifted position. Stillness became consensus. The room had entered its testing phase. This was where meetings often failed. Misread posture, premature authority, or defensive reaction could trigger escalation. The room was designed to absorb that risk. Preparation replaced instinct. By the time Bumpy reached the table, the test was already underway. The room had accepted his presence without challenge. That acceptance carried meaning. Authority had not been denied. Nothing in the room changed visibly. Yet the balance had shifted. Recognition had replaced uncertainty. The worst-case scenario remained contained. The meeting had not begun, but its boundaries were already established. Guns were present, but unnecessary. Violence was possible, but inefficient. Control resided in restraint. This was not a room built for negotiation. It was built to survive negotiation. Every element served that purpose. The absence of chaos was the result. Before a single word was spoken, the room had done its work. It prevented miscalculation, delayed instinct, and forced discipline. War had been postponed without discussion. What followed would matter. But what had already happened mattered more. The room had proven that power could be tested without being spent. No one told Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson where to sit. The omission was not accidental, but calculated a final test before any words were allowed to matter. Chairs had been placed to suggest hierarchy without enforcing it. Everyone in the room understood which seat carried authority. Bumpy did not pause to scan the room. He walked directly to the head of the table and took the chair reserved for the man presumed to be in control. The movement was unhurried and precise. Once completed, it could not be undone without escalation. The reaction was immediate but silent. Postures stiffened, breathing shifted, and attention narrowed without a single word spoken. No one challenged the action because challenge would have required justification. Silence preserved the test. Frank Costello noticed first. His expression tightened, but he did not intervene. Intervention would have acknowledged authority that had not yet been established. Restraint was safer than correction. Albert Anastasia reacted with his body rather than his face. His weight shifted forward, hands resting closer to the table than before. He did not stand or reach for a weapon. He waited to see whether permission would be given or denied. The guns in the room did not move. Their stillness carried more meaning than any visible threat. Weapons were present to prevent miscalculation, not to enforce decorum. Drawing one would have failed the moment. Across the table, Lucky Luciano observed without expression. He did not correct the seating or signal disapproval. Stopping the move would have reframed the meeting as enforcement rather than evaluation. Allowing it reframed it as recognition. Luciano understood the message immediately. This was not a challenge delivered through aggression. It was a declaration made through posture. Authority was being claimed without spending a single word. The room's internal order inverted quietly. The man expected to wait had not waited. The man expected to grant permission had not granted it. Control shifted through acceptance rather than command. No one stood to restore balance. Standing would have escalated the moment into confrontation. Remaining seated allowed the tension to settle instead of fracture. Discipline held the room together. Bumpy's posture completed the statement. He leaned back slightly, hands visible movements minimal. Nothing about his body suggested urgency or defense. The seat had been taken as if it had always belonged to him. This was not courage. Courage reacts to danger. This was calculation measured against consequence. By sitting first, Bumpy removed leverage before it could be deployed. Any demand made afterward would now have to account for the posture already accepted. Words would follow position, not precede it. Luciano recognized the trap and chose not to close it. Correcting the seat would have implied insecurity. Ignoring it allowed the meeting to continue within newly drawn limits. Acceptance became strategy. The absence of objection recalibrated the room. Expectations adjusted without instruction. The negotiation had not begun, but its parameters were already altered. Power had shifted without announcement. This shift required no confirmation. Everyone present understood what had occurred. The chair had spoken before any voice could. Its message could not be retracted. From that moment forward, equality was no longer theoretical. It had been demonstrated. Any agreement reached would now be framed as coordination rather than submission. That distinction would define the outcome. The room stabilized around the new arrangement. Breathing normalized, hands relaxed, and attention narrowed. The test had concluded without violence. That alone confirmed its success. No one attempted to reclaim the chair. No one asked Bumpy to move. The absence of correction sealed the act. What was allowed had become accepted. Luciano waited before speaking. He understood that words delivered too quickly would cheapen the moment. Timing now mattered more than phrasing. Silence finished the work posture had begun. When the meeting finally progressed, it did so on altered ground. Authority had been redistributed without negotiation. The conversation would proceed under those conditions or not at all. That reality was now fixed. What mattered most was what did not happen. No voice was raised. No weapon was touched. No rule was cited. The chair remained where it was. The man remained seated. The room accepted both. Power in that moment was not argued but observed, and once observed it could not be unseen. When Lucky Luciano finally spoke, the room adjusted around his voice. He did not raise it or soften it, and he did not fill the silence beforehand. The tone was administrative, not emotional. That choice was deliberate. Luciano did not begin with demands. He spoke of structure continuity and shared exposure. He framed the situation as a problem requiring coordination rather than submission. The language was designed to sound reasonable. The proposal was presented as protection reframed as investment. Italian crews would provide banking access, legal insulation, and stability against outside pressure. Harlem would retain operational control on paper. The structure suggested independence without autonomy. Luciano avoided words associated with extortion. Protection was replaced with support. Control was replaced with oversight. The offer was constructed to sound voluntary even as it narrowed options. Then the number was introduced, 40%. It was stated once clearly and without justification. Luciano allowed it to exist without explanation. That number was not derived from risk analysis or contribution. It was not calculated from cost or labor. 40% functioned as a signal rather than a share. It defined hierarchy in numerical form. No one in the room reacted immediately. The pause that followed was not surprise but comprehension. Everyone present understood that the figure was not meant to be debated. It was meant to be accepted or resisted. Luciano did not elaborate on consequences. He did not describe enforcement or retaliation. Threats would have reduced the offer to coercion. Certainty carried more authority than menace. The men seated around the table understood what was unsaid. Refusal would reclassify Harlem from partner to obstacle. Obstacles invited attention. Attention eventually produced force. What made the moment dangerous was the restraint. No one shifted in their seat. No one adjusted posture. Movement itself could have been interpreted as escalation. This was the exact moment where wars historically began. An offer framed as cooperation declined in principle, followed by correction through violence. Every man in the room knew that sequence by memory rather than theory. Across the table, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not respond. He did not interrupt, nod, or acknowledge the figure. His posture remained unchanged. Silence became his first reply. The pause was calculated. Speaking too quickly would have acknowledged urgency. Silence forced Luciano's offer to stand exposed. It also denied the room closure. Luciano did not repeat the number. He did not reframe the proposal. Repetition would have suggested insecurity. Confidence required patience. The offer now existed in suspension. It had not been accepted or refused. That suspended state was the most volatile condition possible. Nothing had happened yet, everything was at risk. 40% was not about revenue. It was about who defined limits and who operated within them. Acceptance would formalize oversight without occupation. Rejection would test whether restraint would survive. Every man present understood the cost of escalation. Luciano was weeks from exile and could not afford a war. Bumpy controlled an economy that could not be dismantled quickly. Neither side benefited from rupture. The offer therefore functioned as pressure rather than command. It tested how much control could be extended without resistance. It also measured how resistance would be interpreted. Luciano watched for reaction and received none. He did not misread the silence as refusal. He recognized it as evaluation. That distinction preserved the room. This was not negotiation yet. It was calibration. Both sides were measuring the limits of restraint. Words were secondary to timing. The guns in the room remained untouched. Their presence was constant, their stillness intentional. Weapons existed to prevent miscalculation, not to enforce outcome. Violence remained a possibility, not a choice. No voice was raised, no threat was spoken. The absence of escalation was itself a decision. Discipline held where instinct often failed. The offer remained unresolved as the moment passed. That unresolved state shifted leverage subtly. The room no longer belonged entirely to the man who spoke first. Authority was being contested without confrontation. Luciano allowed the silence to continue. Pressing would have exposed urgency. Withdrawal would have implied weakness. Waiting preserved balance. This was the closest the meeting came to collapse. The proposal had drawn a line that could not be ignored. The response when it came would redefine the entire structure. For now, restraint prevailed. The war that could have started did not. And in that stillness, power continued to move. The briefcase was placed on the table without emphasis. It was neither presented as leverage nor announced as evidence. No accusation accompanied it, and no demand followed. Its presence alone altered the temperature of the room. Inside was a single photograph removed deliberately and passed across the table. The image was clear, recent, and unambiguous in implication. No names were spoken aloud. The silence surrounding it carried the accusation. The photograph did not threaten violence, it threatened exposure. That distinction mattered more than any gun in the room. Exposure invited consequences neither side could control once released. For Lucky Luciano, the danger was immediate and structural. Public disclosure would have triggered law enforcement scrutiny at the worst possible moment. Deportation was already imminent, and attention would complicate everything left unfinished. Stability depended on discretion. The photograph represented more than one compromised operation. It suggested access, surveillance, and reach. It implied that observation had already occurred without detection. That realization changed the balance more effectively than force. Responding with violence would not solve the problem. Killing the messenger would not destroy the evidence. Retaliation would only confirm the photograph's relevance. Silence became the only rational response. For Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson, the decision not to publicize was equally calculated. Exposure would have destabilized Harlem as much as it would have damaged Italian operations. Chaos attracts attention, and attention invites intervention. Control required restraint. Making the photograph public would have burned every bridge at once. Law enforcement rival crews and internal challengers would have moved immediately. No one would remain insulated. The cost outweighed the benefit. The photograph therefore created a deadlock rather than a victory. Neither side could act without suffering disproportionate loss. Action became irrational. Inaction became strategy. This deadlock did not rely on trust. It relied on aligned self-interest. Both sides understood the outcome of escalation and rejected it independently. That shared conclusion stabilized the moment. The guns in the room did not disappear. They remained visible, loaded, and within reach. Yet their relevance diminished as the deadlock settled. Violence could no longer produce advantage. Each gun now represented risk rather than leverage. Pulling a trigger would have collapsed the equilibrium instantly. No one present believed that collapse would favor them. Discipline replaced instinct. The photograph functioned as a lock rather than a key. It closed options instead of opening them. With escalation removed from consideration, negotiation could proceed within defined limits. Power became constrained. This constraint was mutual and therefore durable. Neither side could revise it unilaterally. Any attempt to do so would have reintroduced chaos. The deadlock enforced itself. No copy of the photograph was discussed. No inventory of evidence was offered. The implication was enough. Over-explaining would have weakened its effect. The restraint shown in that moment was deliberate. The less said, the more weight the image carried. Silence prevented misinterpretation. The photograph spoke precisely because it was not explained. From that point forward, the balance of power was fixed. It could not be improved without being broken. Both sides recognized the limit. Neither attempted to exceed it. This was not a negotiation won by cunning alone. It was one stabilized by consequence. Each side knew exactly what it stood to lose. That knowledge froze the board. The absence of public disclosure protected everyone involved. It prevented investigations, retaliation, and opportunism. The story remained contained. Containment became the priority. The photograph was returned to the briefcase. No threats accompanied its removal. Its purpose had been fulfilled by presence alone. The room understood that. Once the briefcase was closed, the guns became background again. They remained symbols rather than tools. Their presence no longer dictated the outcome. Information had taken precedence. This shift marked the true turning point of the meeting. Not the offer, not the refusal, but the deadlock. Power was no longer fluid. It had settled into place. From that moment, escalation was impossible without mutual destruction. Both sides accepted that reality. The meeting continued under those conditions. Nothing else needed to be said. 2. The photograph was never mentioned again. It did not need to be. Its existence was understood. Its silence preserved its power. What followed was not peace. It was a controlled standoff. Each side stepped back without retreating. The balance held because breaking it promised no reward. The guns stayed where they were. They had become unnecessary, but not irrelevant. Their presence reminded everyone of the cost of forgetting the deadlock. Memory enforced restraint. This was how the agreement became inevitable. Not through persuasion or fear, but through locked outcomes. No one could win by moving first. Stability became the only rational choice. The briefcase left the room with its contents intact. Nothing was copied. Nothing was leaked. That restraint protected the future more than any threat could have. The photograph never appeared in court and newspapers or in police files. Its absence became its strength. Silence preserved leverage indefinitely. The deadlock endured. In the end, the most powerful weapon in the room was never fired. It was never even named. It existed only as consequence. And because of that, it worked. The revised terms were delivered without ceremony. The percentage was lowered to 10, not framed as compromise, but as a limit that would not be negotiated further. No explanation followed, and none was requested. Everyone in the room understood that the number itself was the message. 10% did not represent profit sharing in the conventional sense. It represented access without occupation. Money would move upward, but people would not move north. That distinction defined the structure of the agreement. The conditions attached to the number were narrow and explicit. No Italian soldiers would enter Harlem to enforce collections. No collectors would appear in person to apply pressure. Presence itself was forbidden. Payments would be delivered through intermediaries. Couriers would arrive, collect, and leave without ceremony. No displays of authority were permitted. Harlem would remain untouched in both appearance and practice. On paper, Lucky Luciano accepted a smaller share than originally demanded. To outside observers, the reduction suggested retreat. It appeared to be a concession made under pressure. In reality, it resolved his most urgent problem. Luciano did not need dominance. He needed predictability. With deportation, imminent instability posed greater risk than lost revenue. 10% bought order more reliably than 40 ever could. By accepting less, Luciano eliminated daily friction. No enforcement crews meant no confrontations. No confrontations meant no investigations triggered by violence. Stability became the real asset. The arrangement also insulated Luciano from future responsibility. Harlem would operate independently without requiring oversight. Any conflict would be local rather than systemic. That insulation was strategic. For Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, the terms achieved something more valuable than money. Harlem retained autonomy without provoking war. The numbers racket continued uninterrupted and uncontested. Authority remained local. The agreement created a boundary that did not require defense. No one tested it because testing it offered no advantage. Enforcement became unnecessary once the limits were understood. Silence replaced patrols. This was not peace in the traditional sense. Weapons remained available and contingency plans stayed active. Trust was never assumed. Calculation governed every decision. What emerged was not a truce that required renewal. It was a permanent ceasefire built on cost analysis. Breaking it promised no reward. Stability enforced itself. Over the next 2 decades, Harlem remained intact. Italian crews expanded elsewhere but stopped at that boundary. Attempts to probe the line were discouraged quietly before they formed. The absence of conflict became routine. Law enforcement noticed the pattern without being able to document it. Harlem generated revenue but avoided open war. Arrests occurred, but territory remained unchanged. The lack of escalation drew little attention. The agreement outlived leadership changes on both sides. Men who were not present at its creation still respected its terms. Restraint was inherited along with territory. No successor challenged what had already proven final. Luciano left the United States weeks later. From Italy, he maintained distance rather than control. The arrangement required no maintenance or reminders. Its durability was built into its design. Harlem became an exception in the city's criminal geography. Other neighborhoods changed hands as power shifted. Borders moved, alliances collapsed, and violence returned elsewhere. Harlem did not follow that pattern. The reason was not fear alone. It was memory. Everyone understood how the line had been drawn and what it cost to draw it. No one wanted to relearn that lesson. The agreement was never written down. No ledger recorded it, and no witness testified to its terms. Enforcement relied entirely on shared understanding. That invisibility protected it. Documentation would have created vulnerability. Records invite scrutiny and reinterpretation. Silence preserved flexibility. The absence of paperwork was intentional. The guns that once framed the negotiation faded into background presence. They remained available but unnecessary. Power no longer depended on who could fire first. Information and restraint replaced it. This boundary did not represent harmony. It represented finality. It marked a limit both sides agreed not to test. Mutual restraint proved stronger than intimidation. When conflicts arose elsewhere in the city, Harlem remained peripheral. Violence passed around it rather than through it. The line held without reinforcement. Stability became habit. This was not peace. It was a permanent armistice enforced by consequence rather than trust. Harlem stayed untouched because touching it solved nothing. Once that reality was understood, the line never needed to be crossed again. The true victory was not control but avoidance. Both sides gained by not escalating. The agreement succeeded by preventing events rather than creating them. Absence became the outcome. History rarely records what does not happen. No headlines marked the agreement's success. No documents certified its existence. Its proof was the silence that followed. That silence lasted more than 20 years. It survived arrests, deaths, and changing alliances. Harlem remained unoccupied. The line endured. This was not a story of compromise. It was a story of limits. Each side learned how far power could extend before becoming counterproductive. Restraint became strategy. In the end, the most effective boundary was the one that required no guard. It existed because everyone knew the cost of crossing it. That knowledge held longer than any weapon. No document was ever signed to confirm what happened in that room, and no official witness placed their name beneath it. There was no court transcript, no memo, no recorded testimony preserved by the state. History offers no certified proof that an agreement was reached. Yet in this case, absence became the most reliable record. After that night, Harlem quietly vanished from maps drawn in back rooms across the city. Not because anyone feared it, but because everyone understood the cost of miscalculation. Expansion stopped where memory began. Power no longer pointed north, and ambition learned restraint. Money continued to move as it always had without interruption or spectacle. Arrests still happened, headlines came and went, and leadership changed hands more than once. Yet the boundary never shifted. Harlem remained intact not because it was protected, but because it was recognized. Those who knew the story rarely told it in full and never to outsiders. They spoke instead about what never happened and why that mattered more. No invasion followed, no retaliation demanded response, and no correction was required to restore pride. The restraint itself became the legacy. Time tested that understanding more harshly than gunfire ever could. Men died, empires fractured, and alliances collapsed elsewhere in the city, sometimes overnight. Still, the line held enforced by memory rather than muscle. The cost of crossing it was never worth rediscovering. What that night ultimately proved was simple and unsettling. The most durable form of power does not announce itself, and it does not seek witnesses or celebration. It survives by removing the need for violence rather than threatening it. And long after the guns were put away, that understanding remained echoing quietly through Harlem, where the loudest victory was the war that never came. If this story lingered with you, subscribe to the channel for more cases where power wasn't proven by violence but by restraint and consequence. These are the stories that never made the records yet quietly shaped history. Tell me in the comments, do you think the most dangerous power is the kind that never has to announce itself? Join me next time for another story history chose not to write down.